The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello and welcome to the Macabre World podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Digati, and with me today is Paul Gambino. Paul Gambino is an author, and you may know him from his books, Morbid Curiosities, collections of the uncommon and bizarre, Skulls, Portraits of the Dead and the Stories They Tell, and Killer Collections, Dark Artifacts from True Crime. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, I'm thrilled to have you here. All of these titles that you've written, Paul Gambino. If you search him on Amazon, you're going to see these books. And you have something we can't talk about that's in the hopper. We have some more to come.
Yeah, it's actually probably each one of these books focused on the specific collections, these people's specific collections. And this fourth book is almost stepping back and looking at living amongst these collections. So
interesting.
It's a different audience, we believe. It's a new publisher, and probably it would be just a broader audience. I don't want to say the book is a watered down version of it. It is not at all. It's just that the way we approaching it, or the way they want to approach it, brings it to a wider audience. But by no means is it a watered down version of.
Well, when we talk about these collections and morbid curiosities, as a general term, I mean, these are items that for some people can be triggering. They're items that are definitely curious, often macabre. And this coming from a human bone artist, and folks who listen to the podcast know that I make jewelry with human bones. And one of the things that people always ask me is, good God, why on earth would you do that? Like, so tell me a little bit how you got into collecting.
Yeah. Well, it's funny now. The thing about why on earth would you do that? I'm sure by now, when people ask you that, you almost have to think, because it seems just so natural at this point. Like, it's like,
it does.
Well, this is what I'm not offended by it. I appreciate it so much. I'm your approach to quote unquote dead things is not, and you probably the same as me, Judeo-Christian upbringing, this big fear of death. And I believe that's why my attraction to, we'll use the term dead things, is because it's a way, because of that fear. It's a slight way of me controlling this death. If I can surround myself with these dead things, I have somewhat of control. It
almost normalizes it.
Yeah, it normalizes it. So, and I think a lot of collectors, that's one of the reasons why they do, is they feel that they can control it. Interestingly enough, back when I did Morbid Curiosities, an interviewer from National Geographic posed a question. She actually posed it as a statement, and I felt bad that I was embarrassed in a sense that I didn't even come up with this. She said, Paul, I really noticed that when I go through the book, that your collectors are kind of grappling with science and religion. And when I looked back at that, I was like, yeah, it really is the way it is. It's like, it is a grappling. Is it, death so definite, or is it a spiritual thing, and by what they collect, and sometimes simultaneously, many times simultaneously, it is a grappling. Even in skulls, where so many people collect tribal skulls,
right?
Maybe not for the collector, it's a grappling, but obviously for the indigenous people who do collect it, that's definitely a way for them to deal with the death of someone close to them or their enemy. So
right.
That's a long-winded kind of answer of maybe why philosophically I feel attracted to collecting this on a very basic level. I guess I grew up with my grandparents who lived in an old house, and it was purely that thing. My grandmother not collected, but she wasn't a hoarder, but she had a lot of stuff. And as a little kid, I would just go through all the drawers and find like all these old things, and I just felt very comfortable around them. And I guess as I got older, I just continued to surround myself with them. And if you're a collector too, which I'm sure you are,
Oh yes.
what happens is your collections are very broad for the first 5, 10 years, and then you start saying, well, I got to start concentrating, or otherwise I'm just going to be called, my things are going to get too wide. So, and then you start to see, so I've kind of scaled my collections to, if I was to only collect one thing, it would be postmortem photography. So,
Oh, I love those.
yeah, so that's where I would keep it. Um,
Some of
once
them can
again,
be quite tricky. I mean, you see them for sale online.
mhm,
There are some wonderful websites that are devoted to showcasing this very classic
mhm,
form of memorialization. And for some who may not be familiar, we're speaking of I primarily in the Victorian era, maybe just post
yeah,
Civil War, just as photography got to be a thing. Families would take pictures often of the deceased family members. It was the only picture they may have had, especially for a young person or a child, and as that either laying in repose, but in some cases aren't some of these postmortems, they're actually posed.
yeah. Well, two things on that. One is mortality rates were so high,
Sure.
for children. So that was why, and that's what I concentrate on if I can, is children. Because it's so tragic, and I think, and the posing thing, yeah, sometimes they would sit up with a ball, or and things like that. And then you bring up the whole providence thing, or a whole legitimacy thing. That's flooded the market now, and with you know, and they'll put a question mark, postmortem, because if there's a photo of a baby and the eyes are closed, they try to pawn them off and say that these are potentially postmortems. You know what I mean?
But those
And
types of photographs they used to take, it wasn't like we're so used to instamatic type photos where we just point, click, and it's done. And in those cases, many times people had to sit for several minutes
mhm, for sure,
so if it's not inconceivable that a small baby type person might fall asleep while waiting for the
yeah.
photo to finish.
Or those ghost mother photos, where if you look closely, I mean, you'll see the mother is draped like in literally like in a drape of fabric and holding the baby. You can't see her, but you can see the outline
Right.
of her, because so yeah. So that's kind
They
of
still do
where,
that.
yeah,
There's
yeah, I guess they probably do,
very
right?
brief amount of time I worked for Olin Mills when I was in my early 20s, and then like we had these several like fuzzy blankets. We throw them over the mamas to
Oh,
hands and
really?
shoulders so that they could, well, because it's
Yeah,
familiar for the little person, and usually they have kind of a pose they want to do, so it's a lot easier just to have
that's
mom
funny.
hold the kid. Yeah. And it's crazy, but yeah, these photographs, I mean, they're varying, and there's some of them I've seen. I think the earliest ones I've seen look like they're from the old west and old
Yeah,
prairie type stuff, just post Civil War.
yeah,
Well, people still take them today.
I know. Yeah, and it's kind of I guess it's very prejudiced on my part. Like soon as they go color or they're modern, I don't know, that those weird me out, and I don't have any desire, because maybe because once again it's my own you know weird perception of that's too close. When you're
Right.
looking at something that's 100 years old or 120 years old, you're like, oh, well, that's the past. You know what I mean? And I remember seeing some amazing like gang albums, and you would see that a lot, like in Bloods and Crips. You know what I mean? They'd have, and
Yeah.
they were, and unfortunately, death is like a big issue. With people, they're getting killed all the time, and you'll see tons of those photos of guys standing around the coffins and stuff like that. And you know, yeah, that's a really weird thing, and I don't know why. I mean, I think they're, for lack of a better term, they're like cool and interesting, but I don't know if they're too close, they hit too close to home. Not that I'm a gang member, but just time period wise, you know what I mean? It seems kind of
Yeah, it's a little too real. It's a little too recent.
too real. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I always said that outside of the Egyptians, nobody did death like the Victorians.
yeah, yeah. That's
It
for
was
sure.
very formal. There's a
Yeah,
lot of from the jewelry, and there's hair jewelry, there's mourning jewelry featuring usually hematite black onyx, beautifully done,
yeah.
somber rather than your sparkly kind of stuff. And all of it's just exquisite. And there were a lot of customs and things like that. So
And
I'm
morning clothes. I mean, the morning
yes,
clothes are beautiful.
they
You know.
really are.
Yeah.
There and then, and it's there's so if you so you've been collecting it and at least curious since you were a kid.
Hmm.
And I'm, you know, has do you think there's more people interested now, or do you think we just know of each other more because we have the internet to connect? Do
Yeah.
you think there's more people interested? Is it cool now? Because I've been called a weirdo for a really long time. I'm so used to it. It's
Yeah.
not even funny.
I guess it's, and I hate using these things. I guess it's a little of both. I guess it's been exposed to a few more people or a lot more people. So people that were never exposed to it are like, oh, this is something I can get into because of the internet, and gravitate towards it and actually become collectors to a certain level. And on the other hand, like everything else, because of social media and the internet, I mean, we're aware of the whole world's activities. So it's both. It's once again, it's a catch-22, because I ask some of these same questions you're asking me to the collectors themselves, and they're like, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, it's great that all this stuff is out there on the internet, but it's made for bidding wars, and everybody's vying for the same pieces, and
Right.
it seemed like the best time was when before eBay regulated that stuff, and it was like the
Yes.
Wild West, and everything was out there, and people were grabbing skulls for $300, and stuff like that. So, and all
So,
kinds of
well, what's
things.
the average cost? Because I'm sure after you say skulls for $300 to somebody that maybe doesn't collect, doesn't realize how inexpensive that is. Average skull is going for what, about anywhere from 8 to 12
I think
in,
you
in
can,
various.
you're lucky if you find it for 12. And, if you go to like a very high end dealer, they're anywhere from 18 to 22, the average I would say is 17. But then if there's any kind of deformity, a medical issue, then they obviously go up, and those are obviously the more sought after ones. If there's any kind of, if you can get one that has, syphilis, especially in the forehead or on the skull,
Right.
those are going to go big. Um, you know, um,
I know that the
and
fetal skulls are
I was
very
going to say fetal skulls are going to, especially if there's any kind of disease there, you know. So yeah, but the
pathology
average,
pays.
yeah, wow.
Pathology pays.
Yes, absolutely. But the average medical skull and clean with teeth and the jaw, I'd say 17. So if you're looking for one and someone offers you one for 17 and you want one, and it's you go for it. And it seems like that's how skulls came about, the book skulls, because um it seemed like every serious macabre collector had at least one skull. They had,
That's the
even if they
jewel in the
weren't just,
crown.
yeah, you have to have one, even if it wasn't, they were just and then there were the skull collectors. And when I did skulls, I purposely, it isn't just the people that have the most, because
Right.
there are plenty of people in there, not plenty, but there's enough people in there that have one skull. And I guess, I think you might agree with me on some part, it's almost odder to have one skull than to have a collection of skulls, right? I mean, like,
Right. Because it's like it's sort of incongruous. It's by itself. It must have meaning for it to be
yeah, or
a
no, but
focal.
and a lot of these people, they're not really collectors of the macabre, but they have a skull. You know what I mean? It's like, well, that's odder than a skull collector who just
Has several. Yeah, I see what you
yeah.
mean. It's funny. When I talk to people, I do different events throughout the year. I sell at like horror conventions and stuff, and I'll get a variety. I gotta tell you, Paul, it's fun to sit at my table
I'm sure.
as the fans go by, because you're in one of those big dealer rooms, just like
Hmm.
you can picture, and as the fans go by, and people are they're kind of in a gaggle going
Hmm.
in a circle in these rooms. They're cycling around the various tables, and it's always inevitable. They pass by, they don't quite catch it until they something out of the corner of their eye, they see the sign that says real human bones. They double take.
I was just gonna ask you. I was just
Yeah.
gonna say that.
And then
Right?
they kind of go,
They ask it.
oh, wait a minute. And then when they look at it, they look at me, and then I get the real reaction. And some people are like, wow, this is really cool.
Yeah.
And some people are, I mean, I had one lady at a head to toe in Dexter fan regalia, and she goes, you're just strange.
Really?
And I'm like, you're at a horror convention. But she's like, she was just like, well, that's effed up. And I'm like, well, you're dressed as Dexter, okay?
Yeah.
We all got our things. But so people do have, but a lot of people that are interested in what I do, and I'm sure in what you do, outside, I think we've used, what's the name of the podcast, Macabre World, and it is macabre, it's most certainly. But I find that a lot of medical and academic folks, it's more muter than Edgar Allan Poe sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that that's a huge facet of this, outside of, oh, isn't that strange, isn't that dark, isn't that curious, what caused that, like we were talking about the pathologies. There's a lot of medical curiosity that goes on, and some of these antique medical bits and bobs are also sold by the same people, and get a lot of type things, because there's a lot of people ask me about the ethics behind this. For me, it's very easy. I buy from people that are reputable, either dealers or osteological specimen houses, that type of things. And those are usually retired medical specimens.
Right.
The provenance of my bones, I have, I always have paperwork ready, willing, and available for anyone who'd like to see it. It is not a secret where they come from, and it is certainly, it is not illegal in any way, shape, or form. However, let's talk a little bit about the ethics, because one of the things that was brought up to me in a recent interview I did on another podcast was basically, how could you? These people said they wanted to be donated to science to help further education, and I don't think any of them thought they were going to become a necklace. So I tried to explain that, when something gets retired, and it's had one, I'm trying to give it a new life, and I see it as an elevating into an art form. What kind of reactions and what kind of ethics conversations do you have with people about where the provenance of these items and where they end up?
Yeah. There's two different ones. It's and one came obviously with Killer Collections. That became a whole other different thing. The ethics behind that. People collecting crime related.
Right.
But if we go back to the macabre things, I agree with you that there's two things. Most people feel that they respect you justify it by saying, look, I'm bringing new life to this, I'm making these a piece of art. So that is keeping it going, and that doesn't mean that there's any disrespect there. And then a lot of collectors who don't, that display it, say, you know what, when you go to a museum, you're probably seeing, if anything, 25 to 30% of what's actually in a museum, which means 70% of it's in the basement. So I'm displaying it,
Right.
for people to see. And I'm sure every time you go to a collector's house, or when someone comes to your house, they don't stop talking, I mean, about the provenance and the history behind the piece and what it is. So it's not there. And that's why, I've and I'm not saying there's any great shakes to me, because I mean, maybe I find myself in the same situation, so that's why I treat it as such. But I've been able to do all these books because I never, and it's not like I have to finagle it so it doesn't seem. I kind of vet who's going to be in the book first, and I never treat the collector as some kind of freak, or that they're bizarre,
Right.
you know what I mean, or anything like that. Even Nico, who's not a freak, but Nico is very close to being on the line of because of his past, and you do know Nico personally, and I know him slightly. I mean, he's a very, very nice guy, you know what I mean, and all, you know what I mean. So, and he paid his dues. So, but and these people make it a point to tell me that they're curators, They feel that they're collecting and curating pieces of history that maybe a lot of people don't want to collect or turn their back on, so yeah, that's how, and I'm just going to use the word, and it's the wrong word, but it's not to justify what they do, but it's truly their philosophy behind, why they feel it's fine to collect what they collect, and whether it be, human remains or crime-related items or.
Sure. Well, we're speaking of, and just to let folks know, if they listen to in season 1, I have an episode speaking with Nico Clo, who was known at one time as the Vampire of Paris, who I thought his story was actually very inspirational about how he has used art and channeled his darkness into art, and has really showed I think it's a very great story of rehabilitation through art and creativity, and a way for someone to embrace the more positive spin. And I tremendously enjoyed talking with him. And I think that, well, true crime is hip right now. I mean, there's if you want to do a podcast on true crime, I think at this point you have to get in line.
Yeah.
Because there's tons and tons and tons and tons. And even Dr. Phil has a side project that's a podcast on true crime. Referencing his time as a forensic psychologist in the legal system, which was prior to.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's what he actually did. To be honest, I listened to a couple of episodes. I wouldn't say I was his biggest fan overall, but I thought that it was really well done. I thought that it was a side of him that I wasn't used to seeing, because he was talking about, he has access to people that most podcasters wouldn't, because of his notoriety. So when he talks to people, like from cases that are very big, like the JonBenet Ramsey case, and he uses he turns a forensic eye to it, and he's able to get some interesting interviews and tell you what he thought. Well, when I was talking to him, he was doing this, and I saw a lot of these kinds of cues. I thought his forensic breakdown was actually extremely interesting. I thought it was really good. But everybody's into true crime. There's in the sense that, if you look on any of these, Discovery Network has probably about 60 shows.
Yeah.
Easily. Two things that are big right now are true crime and paranormal. And there are those of us I've always been interested. I think all of us don't want to say we're interested in true crime, because if we say that we love the seedy, gory details, which I think most people are, we're people inherently enjoy sensational stuff. And I think I remember being a little kid, everybody would be open during Son of Sam, like can't wait, you got to read the next installment. And that actually, you grew up in the boroughs, didn't you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I lived literally right across the street from where Son of Sam shot the people in Flushing. I look out my window, the front of my house, and it's the bush that he hid behind.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna give away any of your beauty secrets, but I'm gonna guess that we're at least of an age.
Yeah, no,
I remember this happening.
Yeah, I was about 16, 17 during then, going out to clubs, and we thought that every weird guy that we saw at a club,
it had to be him.
We were sure that was him. That was him.
And I remember growing up in my area, Fall River, Massachusetts is very close to where I grew up. We had the Satanic Panic going on, where the cult murders and things like that. So there was always a good story. There's always been a good story, no matter where you are, where you're from. Even if you can't even say the people out in the sticks are safe, because there's like the Iowa murder house.
Forget it. Absolutely.
So everywhere, all of us everywhere, wherever you're listening to this, you have a crazy story that's some kind of like juicy true crime stuff that somebody's going to ask you to tell at a cocktail party.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. And I think that interest, what with the mass media of the internet, is kind of what grew into podcasts and everything. And it culminated, and I'm sure you're if not part of the crew there, you must have some things in their collection. I went to the Museum of Death recently.
Yeah, sure. The one
in New Orleans.
The one in LA.
I
Ah,
went
in
to
New
the one in
Orleans,
New
right.
Orleans, yeah.
Hmm.
And because New Orleans is one of my like favorite cities on earth. I love it there. And that is a treasure trove
Yeah.
of amazing true crime stuff, some very cool funerary stuff and everything. And they did a beautiful job. I'd love to see the one in LA. I hear that's larger and even more spectacular. But
Yeah, I think
it's
in the
crazy.
close right now, technically.
But I mean, there is a huge and your latest book, Killer Collections. You had talked about some of the controversy on collecting these things.
Mm.
Now, I would think that this all has historical value.
Yeah, that's what, and that's what every collector said, in some way, shape, or form, that they collect. This is a part of history that a lot of people would rather not, you know, choose to admit exists, but it does, and it did, and they feel that they curate their collections based on that, and many of them say that they can tell you more about the victims than the average person that's into true crime, who
Right.
just knows about the perpetrator. You know what I mean? So they try to
Sure.
keep the victims, not try to keep their legacy alive, but then they're very sensitive to the victims of these crimes, and I try to make that, reinforce that throughout the book, reinforce that in the introduction, that you know um, that the book is, and I use the terminology, is a book a lot of like whys to why did these things happen, and you know why didn't it not happen, and why did a person choose to do this, and then ultimately why does someone choose to collect, you know um but and it is taking the next step. People would be not telling the truth if they said, like you mentioned earlier, that there's a very few people that don't have a fascination with true crime. So if you feel that, uh,
There's a wow
that
factor there. You want to impress somebody. You want to say something, that's like I said, it makes for interesting conversation.
you mean
You
by
know,
owning these pieces.
but owning these pieces by having a fascination with being able to, I know people who are able to discuss, this case or that case because they've focused in on a particular, dare I say, favorite case,
Yeah,
and they can discuss details
absolutely.
in depth. One of the I'm gonna have to cop to this. It, I am very fascinated with the Lizzie Borden murder case, and I realize that
Ah,
one's a little older, but I grew up in that area. I've been in the house. I've talked to people who made their life's work to study the case. And I grew up around college professors that studied and wrote on Lizzie Borden. So I've enjoyed that. I say enjoy, and that sounds terrible. What if you're one of, there's not really a lot of descendants because that family kind of got fractured, but it sounds gruesome to say, well, I'm fascinated. I enjoy the case. I think it's fascinating. I enjoy being fascinated. I enjoy a puzzle. I love history. So when I see people that say, well, I collect this or I collect that, maybe it's not my bag, but I get why they do it.
mm-hmm. Absolutely, you're right. Yeah, you see
I like
that.
it's I mean, there's some people collect funerary items. I would if I had the budget.
Yeah,
Because I was like,
it's exactly. I try to, but that's the same thing. It's just so expensive. But back to the Lizzie Borden thing, real quick. You saw that Casey Tillman has that Lizzie Borden signed document, right? The whole family.
oh yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that was his. Let's see who's mentioned in it. The rare Borden artifact is divided sheet from 1890, includes the signatures of Abby, Emma, and Lizzie Borden. I mean, that was a
that's
huge thing.
that's a jewel in
Yeah,
the crown right
yeah,
there.
that's a
Yeah,
jewel. Yeah, he loved it. It
that's
wasn't framed yet, but yeah,
that's crazy. But
yeah,
it's and I don't think she did it.
yeah. There is people that say that.
I mean, everybody's got a theory. That's another, I think, another thing that makes it sort of interesting is that in that particular case, it was an unsolved crime.
Hmm.
So, everybody's going to have a theory. That, of course, forensics at the time were not part of this. There's some wonderful books that, for and against different theories and some that let you make up your mind. And it's an amazing case, but it's grisly and it's gruesome. Some like when I visited the house, and part of it was just because I'm a jerk, and when I went to the site
No.
where Mrs. Borden was slain, I laid down on the floor and took a picture, like a kitschy picture,
Oh.
where she had fallen,
Mm.
and quite frankly, she was not all that different in stature than I am, because I'm a bit of a thick chick, and so it was kind of like, oh yeah, well, there's my big tuchus on the floor and where she died. And everybody's like, oh my god, how could you do that? I'm like, everybody does that. It's like
Yeah.
a thing. And I actually met people recently at an event where they were like, oh, let me show you my picture where I'm lying where Mrs. Borden died. I'm like, oh, I have one too.
Oh,
I'm
that's
like,
funny.
there's a whole bunch of us, all of us like prostrate on the floor. But we love our crazy stuff. We love our Lizzie Bordens. But I think I feel a little bit the same way, like that you do about the postmortem photographs. I like that it's antique.
Mm-hmm.
I like that we're talking, that's very Victorian, 1892.
Sure.
But then when you get into the more modern stuff, that's when it seems a little too close to home sometimes.
Well, that's the next thing I was gonna say. A few of the collectors, some of the collectors with dark artifacts didn't want to have anything, never wanted to purchase an item or get the item directly from the person, whereas more than a few had relationships with a lot, as much as you can call it a relationship with with a lot of them, with Manson and Shawcross and
Ramirez.
and Ramirez went and visited, and that's how they got the pieces, by visiting them, and took great pride in having relationships with
well, I've talked to collectors, both personally, and I've also seen in places like the Museum of Death and some touring exhibitions where they're personal letters. It is a collector that took it upon themselves to contact the inmate. And
well, I'm talking about visiting.
And then, well, I mean, it can lead to.
Yeah. That personal letters thing, that definitely, that's, but to actually go and make plans and visit, I saw that, and some of the collectors I spoke to really won't collect too much unless they have a personal, not a personal connection, but can deal with the person personally, with the perpetrator, or
if they can somehow find a rapport.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the Museum of Death, and I'm not sure how that one is set up, but anytime when the Los Angeles one was running, and anybody told me they went there, I always asked them, I would ask them, what was there something about any a particular item in there that kind of freaked them out, and they always would pretty much say the same thing. And I don't know if they moved these things to the New Orleans one. Was there, and I'll ask you this and then I'll reveal what it was, because maybe it isn't down. Was there something in there that freaked you out?
That made me feel unsettled?
Yeah.
I can't think of anything, because all of it's a little unsettling.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But there wasn't anything that. Was there anything that really?
Okay, I'll jump in because it might not have been there. Were the Polaroids up on the wall?
No.
Okay, there's a series of Polaroids in the Los Angeles one where, and I probably should know who they are, but it's a man and a woman. They're both naked, and they're Polaroids, and they're cutting up a body, their murder victim, and it's up on the wall. And everybody, when you look at those, like you say,
if I had seen those, I'd have remembered.
Yeah, and everyone's like, oh, those kind of really just, those just.
It was sort of like their own murder. It was their own like death porn.
Yeah.
Kind of like snuffy porn.
Yeah, exactly.
That is kind of freaky. No, the one thing I have to admit that I saw there, that I had a heavy case of the covets, and as soon as I tell you what it is, I have a feeling either you have one or you want one. Is they had the small child size casket cooler.
Yeah.
The cooler, the Victorian cooler casket with the ice box, the ice jar. Oh, that is just, and it was in beautiful condition.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh. you know, and it's another $7,000 that he has.
Exactly.
It's
I
crazy.
I was just at Evan Michelson's for this other book that I'm doing, and she has on probably one of the smallest Victorian caskets I ever saw, with the glass and everything that in pristine condition. And
They can be so
yeah,
exquisite.
oh,
They're a work of art amongst themselves.
yeah, and it's they're just so the sadness. I mean, like you
There's
just
it's a melancholy
it's a
that's
melancholy. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
you know,
I find it touching because I always think that real art and when you collect something and you love it because it touches you and it moves you.
right.
And that is, it may be dark, but it's a very deep, touching feeling. Speaking of feelings and getting feelings from objects and things like that, haunted objects are for sale all over the internet. And there's lots of people that I have a haunted doll. I have a haunted this. One guy walked by my table and it was very funny because he was one of the ones who was a little appalled at what I was doing. And he just looked at his friend and he says, "You want poltergeists? That's how you get poltergeists." It was very funny. And I actually cracked up, but, and if I have them, I don't think it has anything to do with my jewelry. But there are people selling haunted objects. Do people kind of try to collect and buy and sell those? And how do they know? What's the provenance on these things? What do you hear on that?
That's a question I ask every one of my collectors, and every one of them, except for one, and I'll tell you what they said. Every one of them said, "No, but I wish I did have some." They all say they don't have any, but they really wish they did. And one person said that he wouldn't say it was haunted, but he got it from somebody who said, "Look, I can't have this doll in my house," and quintessentially a doll. Couldn't have this doll in my house anymore. So he took it. It really rubbed him the wrong way, and he got rid of it. And the person that he gave it to or sold it to, or however it got to the next person, they had some real tragedy happened. So he was like, that's the closest thing he believes to potentially an item, that, might have had some bad stuff going down on it. Now, that being said, it's funny because I'm the first to say, look, I don't, and we'll use the word go. I'll use the word ghosts. I don't not believe in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. I think it's silly for anyone to definitively say there is or there isn't. You know what I mean?
Right. Without empirical proof.
Yeah, so I don't know, but I don't. But the haunted item thing, I find a little bit. I find that not hard to believe, but like you say, how do you prove that such an item is? I'm actually going to shoot someone's home. I personally am not going to be shooting them, but on Thursday, who says he has at least 3 pieces that are haunted. And like you say, for my sake and for his sake, I really hope they are haunted. I mean, he wants them to be haunted, so
right.
They are. But I don't know how you prove that a piece.
I mean, I always wondered, and if somebody out there knows the answer to this, feel free to drop me a line. If you go ahead and click on the website for Darker Art Studio, there's an email link, because I'd love to know the answer to this. Do people get it, verified by a medium? Do they have more than one medium? Check it out, or I don't know. I'd love to learn more about that. So if anybody has the answer, there are a couple of stores in the area. There's one out in New Hope, PA, that's not too far from me.
Yeah, I know.
Marion,
right? Marion.
Yes. Yeah. And there's one in Wilmington, Delaware. I actually had Ken and Beth Schuler on from Oddporium to talk a little bit about their collections, and they have haunted collections, and they have had personal experiences with the items. But I see a lot of shows where a lot of people are collecting dolls. I think dolls are freaky anyway.
Yeah, everyone.
I never get it. I mean, I can look at that thing and get the creeps, even if it's just like in the store on the shelf. So I'm like, just make it a weird.
Even a Barbie doll can be like, what is that?
Oh yeah, well, I don't need that for my self-image. But but it's just crazy. But there's so much media, from the internet groups, the online auctions, and books and everything. Do you ever get people who just any kind of pushback? You said you had some with you've mentioned that, sometimes when you're talking about true crime collecting, you'll get a lot of people who find it distasteful.
Surprisingly, not as much as I thought. And it's funny. Before I did any of these books, maybe 3 years before Morbid Curiosities came out, I did a book called Scrap City, which came about in a very weird way. It's a long story how it came about, but it was like the anti-scrapbooking scrapbook. A lot of people that were in the book. Great. So yeah, so before Morbid Curiosities, I did this book called it was called Scrap City, and it was kind of pitched as the original title was actually going to be Scrap in the City, because back then it was Sex in the City was still there,
Right.
but there was all kinds of copyright issues, so it became Scrap City. And it was like the anti-scrapbooking scrapbook. There was like burlesque performers in it. There was strippers. There was somebody who scrapbooked about the murder of a friend. So, but it was all done in very conventional scrapbooking style. I actually got more blowback and pushback and animosity and from that group of people than I've ever gotten from anything else. As if
Wow.
like who is this guy? He knows nothing about scrapbooking. Why is he scrapbooking about this? So that was really kind of surprising. And then equally surprising was the lack of. I know it would be a lot better if I had some great story about, people hating the books, and that I think is, somewhat because
they're beautiful. You have a tremendous eye.
No, and it's just
I really love what you've done. I've seen. They're tremendous.
Well, it's interesting you say about what they look like, because I've always the photography. I want my books to be very photo driven, but the captions are so important to me.
Yes,
you know what I mean, because otherwise, and there's two things with the photography. One is I usually always use portrait photographers to shoot the still lifes, because I feel that they should be, I desperately don't want my books to look like museum catalogs. You just turn the page, there's another one, here's another one, here's another one.
No, they're very engaging, very, very, very centered photographs. They're excellent.
Right, and they're different. Skulls was a bit of a challenge because there's a lot of skulls in there, and I didn't want people to be like, oh, here's another skull, here's another skull. So yeah, so that's one way of doing it, is I feel through the portrait photography done, but with still items, and then the captioning. I always bring this up, like one of my, and I think this is like how it's interesting and how it works. Calvin von Crush, he had there's a little toy, and it's one of those toys you and I may remember. It's really kind of before our time anyway, but they were still around, where you would it would be like a little guy on a trapeze, and you would press the bottom and he would spin around.
Right. It was like a button on the bottom, and
yes,
spin the little wooden guy. Yeah.
Right. And this one was in fact wooden. And and there's a shot of it, and it's shot really nicely, and there's a little piece of paper next to it and everything. And these kind of things I feel are the best. One of the highlights kind of the book, when it's like this, you look at it and you say, well, why is this in a book? Then you read the caption, and the caption says, toy circa, whatever the year was. And there's a note by it, and the note reads, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's pretty much the same thing. Dear Michael, this was the last toy your mother played with before she died. So now all of a sudden you look at that toy, and it's like, now it takes on a totally different.
It does.
But so that's the kind of thing. And then Evan Michelson had this amazing thing. It's another one of my most favorite. It's a jar, and it's a very big jar. This is not visual, so I'll tell you, it's probably about maybe like 16 inches tall and really wide.
Like the big pickled egg jar in the back.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And there are, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny pieces of paper ripped exactly the same. They're $1 bills, and they're ripped these tiny pieces, and she calls it the jar of insanity. And what it was this guy who was in an insane asylum, and it was so incapacitated by being compulsive,
Oh, obsessive
what is that?
compulsive. Yes,
What is that?
OCD.
Obsessive compulsive. Yeah, that he had to rip these little papers exactly, and he just spent his hours and hours and hours and days and months
And it
ripping
filled the
these
jar.
things, and it filled the jar. Yes, absolutely. And when
That's
you looked
crazy.
at it, you could see the pieces were ripped, like as close to exactly as you could potentially rip, and the pieces were maybe like a quarter of an inch by a quarter of an inch each little
Oh,
piece.
wow.
Yeah, they were
So
tiny. They were
that's
tiny.
crazy. So
Yeah,
each bill was ripped in exactly the same manner
yeah,
in minutia. Oh, wow.
yeah. So
Yeah,
those,
that's OCD for
yeah,
sure.
exactly. So those, but the jar is shot like, and I thank you for saying that. The care taken to shoot the jar. It wasn't shot like, oh, here's the jar. Now read the caption. And not everything is shot with like major dramatic lighting, but there's just a respect for the item, and then so that that when you read the caption, it even adds to it. You know what I mean? So yeah,
Well, in Skulls, Portraits of the Dead is the perfect way to describe how the photography looks.
right.
Each picture is unique as the face that the skull represents, and I
Right.
thought that you got a real feel for each piece and each photograph, even though they were all of skulls, but they were each of them was an individual, and it really showed in all the photographs. I've truly have admired your work. And
Thanks.
it's really well done. So folks can go on Amazon and they can look up Paul Gambino and see that you have Morbid Curiosities, Skulls, Portraits of the Dead, and the stories they tell, Killer Collections, Dark Artifacts from True Crime. You have more to come. Is Scrap City still out there?
Yeah, it's still there. It's still out
Okay,
there.
so
It's
very
on
cool.
Amazon also. Yeah.
And also, there's going to be a live link in the description, but folks can go to @MorbidCurio on Instagram if they want to follow you and keep up with what's going on and see some more of your day-to-day stuff. I can't thank you enough for taking time out to talk with me. I really love bones. That's
I'm so happy that you asked me to do this. I totally enjoyed it, thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'll start following you. Now you're going to send me how to do all this, how to follow.
I am. I'm gonna keep in touch because and folks can always go to darkerartstudio.com and they can go ahead and like and follow the podcast itself. And we're gonna throw up some links up there as well. So again, we're gonna be looking forward to your next project. And I want to thank everyone for listening and stay kooky out there.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com.